All right, ladies and gentlemen. So, this is my video about a mini lecture on World War One, and we're gonna just briefly discuss the concept map first, and what are the vocabulary and major connections that you need to remember about World War One. And so, the center of our concept map is really here, where it says, not here. Actually here where it says U.S. enters World War One, and then we're gonna look at what leads from there. So we have two sets of causes. We have the stuff we talked about in class specifically, which are the international causes for World War One. That is M for mania, that's the European arms race. A for alliances. Nationalism, which you should have added on the side. I for imperialism. And then A again as the spark, that's the most immediate cause, as the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And that is when World War I as an international war, primarily in Europe, begins. We don't have the U.S. entering the war, as you can see, until for a while. And so what occurs prior to us entering the war is our policy that Europe stay out of the Western Hemisphere, backing that up with our claim that if Europe doesn't stay out of the Western Hemisphere, we will intervene in Latin American politics, and overall getting us to an isolationist foreign policy. While we are supporting isolationism, which means that we won't be involved, which we take to mean that we won't be involved in European affairs, we are still supporting both sides, that's the Central and Allied powers, both sides of the war. And some things come out of that. The first is the Lusitania incident, which we'll learn about in a moment. The second is the Zimmerman Note, which we'll also review. And so one of the things that we want to remember when we think about the reasons that the United States enters, it's not just because a boat sinks, and it's not just because a note is sent. It is because, and see this box here, because we are concerned with our sovereignty, our right to decide what's happening to our citizens, our territories, and the potential threat of to our actual nation. Something else that happens prior to the United States entering the war is the deadly military innovations, and that is primarily going to be talking about trench warfare, the technology of trench warfare, but we'll get into that in a moment. Once we have entered the war, President Wilson creates a statement that he calls his 14 points. And these 14 points outline what he believes we should do at the end of the war. He goes on the road in order to convince Americans of the 14 points. Though, mind you, please remember, traditionally, like, we have an isolationist policy, so there is a sentiment which means there's a faction or a group within the United States that does not support some of the aspects of Wilson's 14 points, and we'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. When we enter the war, we enter primarily as a part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. We typically call this the Western Front. There's a really famous text called All Quiet on the Western Front that is about this time period. And this is primarily where the United States military, where our army does most of its battling. And one of the standout people that we want you to remember from World War I is Sergeant Alvin York. He's one of the most decorated army men from the war. And ultimately, the war ends with President Wilson going to Paris to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, Versailles is a palace in Paris. And most of the treaties that we learn about in U.S. history are going to have to do with either going to be the Treaty of Paris or they're going to be the Treaty of Versailles. This happens to be the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Wilson, when he goes to Versailles to negotiate the treaty, he takes no one with him. Mind you, that according to U.S. law, the Congress actually has to okay a treaty. The president can't sign a treaty without the full support of Congress. So once he returns, right, Senate Majority Leader Henry Cabot Lodge complains about some of the tenets of the Treaty of Versailles. And the thing that is most contentious is the League of Nations, right? This international peacekeeping organization that Wilson proposed back in the 14 points that Lodge and other isolationists are not in support of. The other major concern from the Treaty of Versailles is the potential that the United States will have to take on some of the economic burden of World War I because of the social, political, and economic devastation that the war has wreaked on most of Western Europe. What's not shown on this map is the Russian Revolution and the rise of communism, though we're going to talk about that in the Roaring Twenties, and the anti-war movement that's occurring in the United States during World War I. So just keep that in mind. We don't have anything on the map that really talks about how the war occurs on the home front. Okay, so I'm going to scroll and show you what I outlined as some of the important details to take away. And I really just went over this information in my brief synopsis, so I'm just going to scroll down so you can see what I've highlighted. The yellow points are what I think are the most important takeaways from these key points. The green is where you have some vocabulary terms to look up next. I highlighted in red Western allies and Central Powers because I want you to remember that the forces that we first are introduced to as the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance eventually changed their names. The Allied powers wind up being Great Britain, France, and Russia. The Central Powers wind up being Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, with Japan coming in super late and allying itself in the end with the Central Powers. And of course, the United States eventually becomes a part of the Allied powers. There are other nations that participate or are drawn into the war, but they aren't the major countries during the battle. So then you can see more vocabulary terms that are being used. I want to add something. I didn't highlight this before, but this is one of the important takeaways about the Treaty of Versailles. The blame for conflict was being placed on the aggression of Germany. So Germany winds up taking most of the blame for the war, and that's really important. That is going to be one of the main causes, right? Because Germany, when it takes blame, has to take economic blame. It has to pay back war debts to many of the Allied powers, and becomes sort of ostracized because of its role in the war, despite the fact that all countries were interested in imperialism and interested in building really strong military and naval backing. They wind up taking the blame for why the war escalates. This leads to the social and political turmoil that we see that gives rise to Nazism in Germany later. And so then I've outlined here what are the important takeaways from the vocabulary terms. And so I'm not going to read all of this out because I really went over kind of in a short way, the main things that I wanted you to take away from World War One. I want you to see that I added a note to the Zimmerman note, haha, that says U.S. enters the war because of security and sovereignty issues primarily. So remember, it's not really about being upstaged or angry at the sinking of the Lusitania. It's really about the moment where we realize that this war is going to affect us, even if it isn't in our neck of the woods necessarily. It's going to affect us, and potentially very gravely, because as we can see, Germany is trying to incite Mexico to fight against us in the war. And so Wilson writes the 14 points prior to the end of the war. It's his blueprint for how he thinks things should be resolved. Okay. For the Treaty of Versailles, please note I said that the Germany was being required to accept the blame and pay reparations, set up for the severe economic depression and social political decline that allows for the rise of Nazism and Adolf Hitler later on. And the thing to remember about Henry Cabot Lodge is that he and Wilson are rivals. Before they were political leaders, and while he is an isolationist and also trying to critique the way that Wilson left Congress out of the decision making for the treaty. Sorry about that, you guys. Wilson left Congress out for the decision making for the treaty. He is also ultimately in opposition to Wilson for personal reasons. With the League of Nations, please just remember it's a precursor to the United Nations. League of Nations, League is World War I, United is World War II. What do we want? What was their main purpose when we say that they were a international peacekeeping organization? They were going to prevent more wars through collective security and disarmament. That disarmament means that they are going to push that different countries dismantle their navies and armies and get rid of the really dangerous war technology that had developed in the United States. And to push that we have open negotiations for international disputes, because prior to this, often the treaties that were signed between nations were private, and so they would just another country may not know that there are alliances or problems, and so that different countries have alliances with each other, or that different countries were trade partners. And that's what leads to the alliance system problem, right? There's a moment where, for example, Austria-Hungary reaches out to the Ottoman Empire and is like, hey, if you back us, when Germany reaches out to Mexico and tries to secretly get Mexico to support them in the war, this portion about settling international disputes through negotiation and arbitration is about trying to end that and having kind of open and honest wars. However, it's doomed to fail because one of the largest police powers and still economically viable countries, the United States, refuses to enter in the organization, and ultimately the League of Nations cannot do what it sets out to. And when we fast forward about 20 years, not even 20, 15 years, to the 1930s, an economic depression that has settled around the globe, not just the United States, leads to World War II.